Good morning. This is Jonathan Albin, Game Master's Guide, and I got such a show. We're going to be talking about NPCs. We've done this a couple of different times, and I just like talking about them. But in this episode, we're going to be talking about how they might make or break your game, and some tips on how to handle them, how to use them, and how they can be of great effect. If you haven't yet, hit all the buttons down below, because hitting the buttons down below validates your existence on this planet. No, I'm kidding. And also, check out our Patreon our Patreon account at patreon.com/Nycos if you want to be part of our community. All right, I'd be being silly this morning. Alrighty, so in our opening salvo today, we are going to take on the actual topic directly: the power of NPCs in RPGs, why they make or break the game. And I'm using the word why here very particularly. I'm going to be looking at this from both positions. There are places where the NPCs can absolutely make your system really fly, and there are times when the NPC is worse than the wings on a frog. They're not really producing the effect that you want, and they're taking up a lot of time and are distracting from the core of where you're trying to take the story. So it's, as in any subject, as you see from my little orange and black lights, they move up and down, and then that I picked that specifically because that is really where a lot of these subjects go, where any side of this can be too heavy, and other times can be exactly what you need. So take the advice that I provide with a grain of salt, but realize that I'm here to help you make everything work the way you want it to work, and make the game really pop so your players want to come back week over week. My my button got stuck. Sorry about that. Yeah, so before we do that, we are of course going to visit the world of Nycos, and we're going to spend just another day in Concordia. If you look on my map here, Concordia is in the top center. It's a city-state, as most of the areas that we have talked about so far in this series. And Concordia is a relatively new city. It wasn't even founded until the fourth iteration, mainly because the climate was problematic. When you get north of Florin, you're pretty much into an Arctic climate, and so the shattered stones, which at the time were far less shattered, there's a story coming in there, but the shattered stones area is pretty much in permafrost condition, and the capital of Concordia, which of course being a city-state is Concordia, it would normally suffer from the ravages of the extreme cold and ice as its eastern counterpart, Cryopathia, but instead has a relatively mild climate based to something known as the Cairstone, Caer. It's a word that the Eldrin had brought to the area, and these were the establishment of an Eldrin city required either a seedling from a home tree, or, which of course every other Fey realm has lore about, but in Nycos you can also establish a community with a care stone, and these stones were originally established as a singular item to build a community upon, kind of like a keystone would be to a large structure. But in the case of Concordia, the first settlers in this area, being Eldrin, established a fairly decent area. It's roughly the size of 7 hexes, and the city of Concordia is centered in those. And around that periphery, they placed not one, not 10, but 100 of these care stones, building a boundary and a barrier that provided a radical change in climate, making Concordia survivable and indeed caused it to be, although the terrain is still rough as the rest of the Shattered Stones, Concordia is actually forested and quite a lot of plant life. Now, as you see, the map here doesn't show any of that forestation, and that's simply because we haven't had any visitors to the city. Now, the city was previously established in lore and in the history of the elves, and so therefore it was established on the map, and so it's an accessible point, but we haven't had anyone actually make it to there, so the map hasn't been embellished. You'll also notice, disturbingly, on the edge of Concordia is one of the interesting green pylons, and the other pylons have all been priest king outposts, most of them processing centers or prayer centers and that kind of thing, but no one's been to this one, so I'm not going to go into the details. But to give a little bit of background on Concordia, as I said, it was established in the third iteration by an Eldrin expedition. They were enjoined, but they only got as far as establishing the city and creating the Circle of Stones. And so beyond that, there hasn't been any advancement. And as far as in that time period, they didn't get any further than the creation of the city itself. In the fourth iteration, the Dogs of War spent a considerable amount of time in Concordia as they had established it as their base because it was so distant from other organizations that they could fundamentally operate with impunity because there wasn't anybody to prevent them. And at the end of the fourth iteration, the government of Concordia established a direct link to the city of Moriah, which we talked about just recently. And in the development of that communication between the two cities, a direct teleport I'm using a platform, I guess, for lack of a better word, was established in Concordia, and thereby you could transit between the two cities and fundamentally, therefore, across the world in a blink of an eye. This becomes very instrumental in the fifth iteration because when the pact was established, it was actually signed by the signatories here at Concordia, and because of that, there was a central communications center, for lack of a better term, established, and it was from this Concordian center point that the pact was distributed to all of the various nations, and in the fifth iteration led to the incarceration and imprisonment of the majority of the mortal population that would not adhere to the centurion law. And we'll talk more about that when we do an entire established video on the pact itself. It's quite a story. Going from the fifth iteration into the sixth iteration, Concordia was virtually ignored. There were a couple of attempts to raid some of the vaults of the ancients that are now established in Concordia because of its extreme isolation, but those were fruitless and led to the death of quite a few of the enjoined who made efforts. I would argue that was probably during my most violent phase as a game master, where I was responsible for two of my historically four TPKs and total party kills. It wasn't pretty. And when we enter the seventh iteration, this becomes the anchor point for the great conflict that ends the iteration. And so the The Battle of the Blue occurs near Concordia, as does the rise of Tyndall. And those are separate stories on their own. So we'll come back to those as well. Really wasn't much of a transitional point between 7th and 8th iteration concerning Concordia, mainly because the adventuring partners never made it that far north. At the beginning of the 9th iteration, however, very end of the 8th iteration, the goddess Miri established her original temple of the Veils here in Concordia, the first Rainbow Temple, and it was actually consecrated by the broadcast of Ralgrim, which happened in its vicinity. So, by the way, there's going to be a whole lot of interesting news in tomorrow's Nycos News Network that has to do with the broadcaster, but we'll come back to that. So in the modern time, Concordia has yet to be visited by an adventuring group. It's established on the map as not only being a center for the learning and history of the world, but it's also established as a full established city-state. So it does have all of the amenities one might find when visiting one of the cities of Nycos. It has Ironhead Railway, it has the Crackspell Community Library, and of course the Raven Exports facilities are found at every one of the cities in Nycos now. So a lot of information about that will be coming in future videos. I want to thank you for continuing with us, and so now we're going to go ahead and move on to the rest of the world. When we talk about NPCs, I'm always a bit reluctant to talk about the subject of non-player characters merely because I feel that the term has become overused. Now, therefore, I've got a completely different series of terms that I use when I refer to my NPCs, but we're going to talk a little bit about standard non-enjoined persons, which is my term for NPCs, and how the NPC fits into a game, and how to really use them effectively to really make your adventures and your stories stand out and draw your players to want to continue session after session. So the first thing we need to talk about are the nudes. And when I say that word, I know that somebody's in a basement going, hey, he said the word nudes. Hey. But nude stands for non-enjoined window dressing. And these are the closest, I think, in approximation in my world to what people think of as NPCs in the general community. The idea of a being who who's a flat piece of the background, he or she is moving through the scene for visual purposes to give a context of how populous the area, why did I say that? How populated the city is, how big the community's population, what kind of industry, what kind of occupations, what kind of entertainments are available in a community. And these are all necessary elements. Alas, most of the time they become fundamentally noise to your campaign. And so we're going to talk about what to do with the window dressing. And fundamentally, we've already talked about you create the window dressing by giving them a noun, verb, and an adjective to give an idea of what they're actually doing in the scene, why they're there, what they're, are they going to be somebody that the players will interact with, or are they simply somebody walking through? And when you develop the realization that the demographic of the nudes in your group and nudes in your game, you are providing each scene with the appropriate number of bodies simply for occupying the space. we are talking fundamentally in theater of the mind. So if you say that you're in a town, you would assume that if you were in a town at any given point, you are probably less than a stone's throw from a half dozen to 3 dozen to 300 people. And if you're in a city, that even gets a larger number. And by having a realization of what your dynamic demographics will be, and understand where or how many NPCs are going to be walking through, then you can kind of balance that. Because if you put the players in a city and then they ask if there's anybody around to talk to, well, yes, 1 million people, but these are all fundamentally not people that are going to be useful to them. So we have to therefore give the opportunity for them to find the next kind of characters, next kind of people. And that would be VIPs in the story. And the very important personae are those individuals that they run into that the story can't progress if they're not there. Now, some of them will be recurring. Some of them will be story related only. Some of them will be literally one-shot data drops. But the idea here is that they have to differentiate the level of importance of the NPCs so that they are engaging with them in such a way that they're getting the information they want and it's not cluttering the storyline. I think one of the most dangerous things is that a game master can become very enamored of their own creativity and their own NPCs and want to spend more time in that conversation with that NPC than the players really want. And that can create a bit of back pressure because it feels stilted, it feels false when the players aren't desiring the communication. So understanding the relative positioning of your NPCs and making sure that they fit into the purpose of the scene and all of that, it makes it make more sense. Now, in certain critical scenes, there you need to come up with a way for the NPCs that you need to be in the place at the right time. That sounds easy. Oh yeah, we just simply say they're there. But one of the things you really have to realize is that in the case of every being within the world, they have a time path that they're passing through. They are moving from point A to point B to point C. So if they are going to be, if it's, for example, it's contrived for you to meet with the baron of an established barony in the middle of the afternoon, where would that happen most likely? And if you think about where that scene is, then you can determine who else might be there and thereby derive a pool of NPCs that would be available, both of the window dressing style but also of the deeper importance styles. And so by linking those together, you create, more importantly, useful and understandable and relative scenes rather than just simply set pieces. I think that sometimes we look at role-play games sort of the way people in the dramatic environment look at theater pieces, in that you do, setting, stage, and therefore you're building out where they are and you're not dealing with why they're there. And so it's important that if you want to make your games really pop, you give them a reason to be in the locale. And I mean, in certain cases, this is obvious. If you're talking about, as I said, talking to a baron in a barony, you more than likely have to set an appointment, and therefore you can be more contrived in terms of how it happens. But if you're trying to literally wander into or stumble into that same baron in a location that is not part of your story already and not part of that baron's current process, you have to explain why he's there. And this goes back to something else we've talked about before, and I'm not going to go into it very long here, but the idea of establishing the scenes. As you're doing your narrative discussion with the players and setting it up, there needs to be some exposition, especially if you're doing it theater of the mind. But that setup can actually be a matter of the function of the characters that already exist. So just realize that the interactions that you have with NPCs necessarily are going to take some time out of your game session. So if you have a games group, for example, that's really fast, much more in tune with the combat aspect, and they want to get right to the fights, then you're by necessity having to cut your time spent with an NPC to bare bones. So therefore, it makes more sense for you to establish how the scenes formed homogeneously and heterogeneously, that it just is natural for the players to be in the places that they are when these conversations occur, so they don't feel just like, hi, I am in a box and I need to talk to a person in the room, and I am. You want to make it feel more like an actual conversation. Now, when you're doing this, as you're building this story out, certainly you want to focus on your primary NPCs that you've, in the case of this Baron, you obviously are, if you're talking about traveling it through a barony and you're going to get a chance to talk to the Baron is going to be developed as a persona, at least to some level, because you are wanting, he's the person who's in charge here. So when you've built him out, it's important to remember that you also need to work with the concept of understudies, because you never know when the players are going to find themselves in a conflict where the Baron accidentally gets murdered or gets, in a combat scene, he valiantly defends the party in some fashion and dies. So knowing not only what NPC is in control or in the scene, but also to realize who you might have to talk to if the Baron is incapacitated or removed from the scene. This gives you a kind of a continuity flow that feels more natural, and your players will appreciate the fact that they can find the answers to the questions even if the primary contact has been taken out of the equation for whatever reason. Now, also, you have to be careful when you're dealing with your casting, is to make sure that if you build any red herrings into the scenes, that you've taken that into account in terms of the amount of time the players have to work on the adventure. In other words, you want to make sure that you don't overburden them with possible other side quests. One of the jokes of roleplay games is that there are times when you simply know that you're on a side quest. Well, we in our real lives don't really think that way. When we are doing something, if we choose to go in a different direction, we make that choice. We may recognize we've got something else we want to do in the future, but we're not going on a side quest. It's not like we know that primary story is going to stay right where it is. We have to monitor all of it all the time, and so therefore your red herrings need to be believable, credible, and solvable in a short period of time. Otherwise, they become alternate quests, not just side quests. And there are a ton of other traps. We're actually going to have to do an entire episode, I think, on the traps of story, because when you are building a story with everybody else putting in their input, you are going to find yourself caught in several different types of traps, literary traps, that make the game cumbersome or clunky or difficult to process. So when you're building your cast, make sure you watch out for those persona that you're putting in the scene that are intentionally red herrings, and more importantly, watch to make sure that they don't become a trap for the adventurers, which takes them off the game and makes them feel uncomfortable and unfruitful and that kind of thing. It's also important when you're talking about utilizing NPCs that you vary the intensity within the cast. And what I mean by that is, if every time they come into town, the one guy they need to talk to always walks up to them and just starts blabbing, that's not useful. Now, certainly there are games groups who would appreciate that, because then you get right onto the fights, and that may be well and good. But if you're looking for a true roleplay experience, you're going to be wanting to find ways to make the engagements themselves feel necessary. If your news source goes from being an absolute, panderer who does walk up and just blab, over to the other end of the spectrum where they actually have to hunt down an individual who knows something but he's not willing to talk. This idea of varying their intensities gives more living space to those NPCs so that they get the opportunity to be seen as living, breathing entities. And I have a very good friend who admitted that until we had this conversation about NPCs and how to make them come alive, he had never even considered the NPC, the walking cardboard cutout with the question mark floating over his head, was anything but that when you were dealing with a tabletop RPG. This is to say you need to get comfortable with REPs, the recurring NPC. Because if a recurring NPC is going to be showing up week over week over week, you need to develop his personality, you need to develop his history. If he's got a vocalization pattern, you want to establish which one it is and stick with it so that the players will also feel comfortable. In my own campaign, arguably one of my most well-known NPCs is Angus Hereford, who is a Tarmakian, a Minotaur, who happens to be a weapons dealer, and he's also a great square dancer. He's the love of his life is Lily, and she makes sure he wears the corks on the ends of his horns so he doesn't tear the wallpaper. The depth with which you become familiar with your regularly occurring NPCs, the more comfortable the players will feel in that environment and feel like it's actually a home and a place to live. But you also have to be sensible with your SCPs. And generally, an SCP won't develop into a recurring personality unless you intended that from the get-go, in which case it would have been focusing on him as a recurring rather than as a story. But when you're talking about an NPC who's going to be dropping pearls of wisdom on the players, he has to be trustworthy. He has to be associated with some function within the game that makes his role make sense. And he can't just blurt out information because the players have to be able to trust that information. So be sensible, be thoughtful of how they meet, where they meet, why this person is in that locale, why the meeting place is such that it is. There are reasons that the NPCs want to meet in those locations, so embellish, expand. And when you do so, you give yourself more air to breathe, so to speak, and more opportunities going forward from there. So, for example, if you're meeting constantly with a cooper out by the waterside, why is a cooper about by the waterside? Oh, he's receiving his barrel materials as people are sending him the wood and the copper and the brass to be able to build the rings. Ah, okay, that's why he'd be down at the water line. Well, having that explanation now gives opportunity for maybe scuttlebutt that you hear about what's going on, considering a monster on the river that might be worth hunting down or whatever. The point here is that your persona development for NPCs is essential, because if you want that world you're building to feel real, it has to be real, and you have to therefore, as the director and the games master, have to really play out the roles of those characters within the frameworks of their lives. Otherwise, it's a two-dimensional cutout. Okay, so we've talked about how NPCs can make your game. And so now we're going to talk about the various types of NPCs that can really miss the mark and harm your campaign. It seems silly to say that you could be creating too many NPCs, because that's not a truth, because your world is obviously populated. There's people that live there. So the idea here is that we're going to talk about those that are in-game barriers to the course of the story that you're telling. And the first of these are the ubiquitous archetypes. I had a friend of mine, big guy. His name was Scott. And he's somewhere in the range of 450 to 500 pounds. Just a mountain of a man. And when he would be the game master back in the day, and that was quite a while ago, we're talking about when I was actually a player, which I was also always a game master, but you get my point. He would always talk about the bartenders at his bars were always, he would say, yeah, she's a big woman. Just imagine me with tits. And pardon my French, but the point was, he didn't want to go through the effort of building an NPC for that barkeep. And he was right in a way. The idea of the window dressing doesn't have to have a personality. It doesn't have to have depth, but it has to be a living being. And when you make them ubiquitous and they all are the same, and you undermine one of the core dynamics that makes role play happen, and that is when you have somebody in a role that is more than just a piece of window dressing, there has to be more to them. So when you've built them out and you've made them ubiquitous, you've made them fundamentally just noise, and that actually can cause problems in your story, because then people start to objectify them or treat them as less than. And those elements of roleplay that depend on good NPCs mean you can't have a lot of bad NPCs. So fundamentally, you want to get rid of your ubiquitous archetypes and make sure that, yes, you don't have to give them full depth and personality, but do remember noun, verb, adjective, and have them doing something, and therefore their purpose is already defined, so that the players don't have to try to glean from them any particular information that may or may not be useless. The second thing is talk about cookie cutter. Yes, I understand you can say that all your guards are wearing the same armor, all your guards are carrying the same weaponry, all your guards smoke luckies. You can set whatever cookie cutter relevance that you want to your personas, but really when your players interact with them, the fight scenes and such can be so much more when they are not simply tin soldiers that you just knock over one after another because they all are identical, because that's not real. I know I've often said that you need to make sure you follow the rule, follow the opposite of the rules of an overlord, evil overlord. But yes, you can have them all wearing the same uniform. That's fine, but make sure that they are, Hanzo and Franz, the two guards near the western side of the compound, don't have to both be, the same height, same weight, same style. You can vary it a bit, and you need to stop using the idea of the cookie cutter when the cookie cutter demonizes or defines the individual out of existence, because you are flattening what could be a very rich scene. The idea that Hanzo and Franz are the guards on the side. Maybe one of them is sympathetic to the current cause, maybe the other isn't. And so there you have a possibility of having a conversation that will either lead the party to more good story elements, or you can simply bypass it and move on. But the point being is that if they were flavored rather than straight cookie cutter, then they are beings, and the players will act with them accordingly instead of treating them like a check mark and a pool of experience points. Next are convenient idiots and collateral damage. I say convenient idiots only because there are times in every movie trope you've ever seen when they start a fight scene in the center of a city, there's always a half dozen clucking chickens or two or three local wives that are running from place to thus, or perhaps a couple of rambling street urchins. The idea here is that these convenient idiots, it's strange because in some cases the game masters that I know will utilize them to be, oh yeah, I saw the guy crossing the street half an hour ago and he's in that building. Well, why is that guy even there? Why, if that guy that walked in the building was a villain and the party members are supposed to be hunting the villain, why in the world is an innocent walking through the street going to flat out say where they are? Because if that NEP knows that guy's a villain, he's going to be worried about his life, and he's not going to tell anybody anything. So having convenient idiots is one thing. The worst, I think, though, is collateral damage. And I've seen this happen hundreds of times, wherein the players decide to do an action that's going to be of an area of effect, and they don't even consider, okay, you're doing a blast-type attack next to a building that's got a thatched roof. If you're not thinking about that, you're going to start a fire and burn somebody's house down. But because they're NPCs, the adventuring group will break convention. Whereas if they knew the individuals, they knew of them and knew about them and knew what they did, then maybe they wouldn't take that kind of action. So just realize you can get rid of a large number of convenient idiots and reduce collateral damage simply by making sure the players are interacting with the NPCs that you do have in such a way that they see them as living, breathing beings and therefore having value and are not just something to throw away. Now, this also leads to a separate element of the same thing, and that is ambiguous hostages and pointless victims. There are a lot of players that really want to pursue the hero's journey. They want to see themselves as the good guys. And so when you give them the opportunity to engage with a scene, sometimes you're enticed to put in hostages or perhaps victims. In a recent scene, we had our big bad decide to liquidate his resource, which was human capital. He had prisoners, and the party had pushed his buttons, and the bad guy is a bad enough guy that he eliminated them. Now, what made that scene important is that there were several people in that group that were eliminated that were being pursued by my players, and they had put a vested interest value on those individuals, and therefore the horror of this destruction was not only was it a more poignant villainy because the players reacted to it viscerally, but it proved my point that you need the victims and the hostages to be something that the players want to resolve and want to save. And when you make them more ambiguous, you make them more pointless, they no longer have the impact. And I think that's part of what's contributed to the feelings about NPCs that the world fundamentally has, that they are worthless, that they are other than us. And I also think that, to get on my soapbox a little too far, perhaps, I think this also is why we have difficulties in communicating with other people in this world today, because we see others who don't agree with us as fundamentally being NPCs. We see them as flat and not to be interacted with, and we've taken away our own ability to converse. But we'll get rid of that. Okay, so then the vanishingly irrelevant are those NPCs that maybe served a purpose 3 scenes ago, but they aren't useful. And like, for example, you have a cobbler, and you needed a pair of shoes fixed. So your character goes into the shop, meets the cobbler. Cobbler fixes the shoes. 2 days later, when he comes to pick up the shoes, that cobbler now starts being seen everywhere. He's an NPC that you built. You kind of think he's clever. You like the name you gave him. You really want him to be a part of the scene. But the farther you go from the point when they actually had relevance, the worse it is in terms of time suck for the rest of the game. Players don't want it. Players don't need to talk to the guy. Yeah, he's kind of a clever NPC, but he's not pertinent any longer. And so I'm not saying to eliminate them. They certainly can be there in case that somebody needs to have another pair of shoes or whatever, but they are irrelevant to the other scenes that you place them in. So make sure you're not creating too many of these vanishingly irrelevant NPCs. Next, I think some of the ones that you miss the mark on a lot, and that is the idea of the helpful stranger or the guardian angel. In the case of the helpful stranger, this is the party has gone into a conflict. They've gotten their hat handed to them. They've been trounced, and they're on their back heels, and they're concerned what they're going to do. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a benevolent stranger shows up and says, "Come with me to my house, and I'll give you all the resources you need." And 24 hours later, the adventurers are back on the road, and that NPC will no longer be seen ever again. But that idea that the rescuer, and this applies to the guardian angels as well, those people who swoop into the scene to save the PCs from themselves, these are some of the least useful and arguably the most egregious of these NPCs that miss the mark, because you're there to make the game exciting and adventuresome. It's up to the players to determine their way out of the box, so to speak. It isn't your duty to save them. And when you do this, you destroy your own sense of urgency that was built in to the system with the danger that the players fed. The next are the obligatory panderers. This is, you've gone into a bar, so who are you going to meet? You can name 4 people that you're going to meet. Just in about every game bar out there, and that's because everybody's seen Friends, right? Everybody's seen Cheers. The idea of the characters who show up and go, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here," blah, blah, blah. Every Walmart greeter says the same thing, and we all say, "No, I don't need any help," to them. So why are the players forced to interact with the grumpy dwarf at the bar who's partway drunk? Why do we always have to deal with the buxom bartender who's flirting with the players? That you don't have to do it in every scene. You don't have to do it every time. These obligatory characters are fundamentally a waste of your players' time. Sure, every once in a while, have a scene like that. But generally speaking, every time they walk in the bar, they shouldn't have to be faced with the same challenges. And if they come in looking for trouble like that, then maybe there's an issue on their side of it. Beyond these NPCs, of course, the others that can be really problematic are the ones that are unrealistic or anachronistic. In other words, if a person from history suddenly shows up because you need to give them information, that expository process might be better served by them finding an item that has that information, a book or a recording of some sort. And as far as anachronistic, sure, that this is, if you are in a town that has a civil law and a legal system, why is there also a chief executioner walking around? He should be almost titular by this point in the storyline, because the story no longer needs that rough justice to be a civil community. These unrealistic NPCs tend to drag down and bottle up, if you will, the excitement that you might have had in the scene, because they are literally like pouring splashing cold water on them. In reality, I'm coming down to this last point, that is that NPCs are like die rolls. And that seems to dehumanize them or to undermine the very thing that I'm saying. But the reason why I say this is that your true NPCs, not necessarily the nudes we talked about earlier, but we're talking about the actual recurring or story PCs, are like dice rolls in that you never absolutely have to have them, but they are, once they are established, they need to be treated with the respect and accepted for their value as they are. Don't allow them to become irrelevant. Don't allow them to become obligatory. Instead, constantly be renovating and creating new NPCs, because as players adventure through the world, they're going to meet thousands of people. Now, of course, we as game masters are a finite number, so it's important that we are able to make these connections and bring these roles together so that the players get the information that they need to. But we also need to be sensible about it, and don't let NPCs break or harm our game system. All right, the end of the matter is this. We've talked about NPCs on the positive side, we've talked about NPCs on the negative side, and the question still remains, and I'm going to answer it now, is do NPCs make or break a game? The short answer is no. The idea of a non-enjoined person, an NPC, in a game doesn't by itself break the game. However, if you fall into the traps that we've talked about, if you fall into the patterns and routines that create way too many of these obligatory NPCs, or perhaps don't create enough dynamics within your NPCs to make them feel alive, in either direction, you can actually make or break the game with NPCs. So I wouldn't say that the NPC himself is what's breaking the game. It's your utilization of them. So we definitely need to hone our skills, build out NPCs in such a fashion that their utility matches with their existence and their reality, and that they are seen as they are, as living, breathing beings. So I want to thank you for being with me today. This has been the Game Master's Guide, and I'd like you to push all the buttons down below, because that's what makes you a cool person. No, I'm kidding. So also, if you want to be part of our community, join us at patreon.com/Nykos. Once you're a member there as a supporter, then you gain access to our Discord channel and therefore can become a player in our games that we do weekly. As a matter of fact, there's been some new openings there, so there's plenty of room for new players to be added in that realm. And that had everything to do with an advancement and a progression rather than a loss. So anyway, I want to thank you for being here. Again, I'm Jonathan Albin. We will see you in the next episode. Do remember we do record. I always forget this part. We record every day, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m., and we stay on for about an hour or so, and we're a little bit less than that this time. But I want to thank you for being here. We will see you next time.